Joseph?
Thank you, Chairman Pierce. I wanted to briefly outline the reasons why I think the board should consider revisiting its policy of permitting the refiling of election petitions within 6 months of a voluntary withdrawal. The current board precedent, if you look back to the origins and Sears Roebuck, offers little substantive reasoning about why the board drew its distinction between voluntary withdrawals and election bars, and more fundamentally, there's little guidance as to whether that reasoning is still valid given current practices. In my experience and the experience of other practitioners with whom I've discussed, many of these withdrawals, at least in recent times, have occurred much closer to the time of the actual election. As we all know, elections can be disruptive, they are costly, and they are time-consuming, especially as they progress. And one stated purpose of the NPRM is to promote greater certainty in the election process. And so it seems to us that to the extent that the employees or union in the course of an election elect to keep their powder dry and await another day, that is obviously their prerogative. And I'm not suggesting that we task the regional directors with embarking upon examining the reasons in every instance why that may occur, but I would submit that to the extent that they elect to withdraw the petition voluntarily on the eve of the election or close to the election, that should bear greater consequence for electing to wait so long to do so in the interest of promoting some greater certainty to this process. In terms of what that time period would be, I think it probably needs to wait in part to get an answer to some of the other questions that the board is grappling here with in terms of what the timing of elections should be. But it seems to me that the shorter the time period, the earlier in the process that bar should apply, and so that the withdrawal of the petition should result in a one-year bar the same way that the outcome of an election would, arguably to apply to the entire time period if, in fact, it ends up being as short as some people have surmised here. I think here, to the extent that the labor organizations are looking for greater certainty and greater speed in these elections, that they would occur more quickly, it seems to me that a corresponding consideration should be given to whether, if they choose to withdraw from that process, whether there should be a consequence that more parallels the outcome of an election, rather than electing that, giving them some greater ability to re-engage on some shorter time frame. Employers obviously want certainty too. I think employees want certainty as much as possible, and so it seems to me that a fairer process, especially if the board is going to consider some shortening of these time periods, would be to take the voluntary bar and run it coextensive with the election bar. I appreciate your letting me have the opportunity to address you on these and other matters over the last 2 days.
Thank you.
What impact, if any, do you think that would have on parties' willingness to enter into stipulated election agreements if basically once they had done so they would be, or once they start negotiating about it, they might be stuck with a longer bar?
Well, again, it seems to me that if the outcome of this process is a more streamlined process where there's fewer opportunities for there to be issues contested before the election is held, it seems to me that if you've put yourself in that process, then I think that unions are looking for fewer barriers to get to an election. And so it would seem to me that they would not necessarily have less incentive to reach a stipulated election, because all of this is purportedly about getting to the election sooner rather than later. So I don't think that that would result in fewer stipulated elections.
Okay.
And what concerns does this address?
I think it addresses the question of whether or not there is greater certainty in the outcome of holding elections. I think that is certainly part of what the board is required to ensure, that there is a finality to this process. And to the extent that we are having elections run up to the eve of an election, these are very time-consuming. They're very disruptive. They can be very emotional matters. And it seems to me that if unions are going to embark upon this process at a time of their choosing, we're entitled as employers to see some certainty to that process. And I don't see any fundamental reason why, especially in a shorter election period, that certainty shouldn't run coextensive with the bars that the board has put in place for other elections.
But are you suggesting that there would be more withdrawals now? under the new rules, or are you suggesting that this should be a change that should be made no matter what the process
I
is?
think it should be made no matter what. What I suggested in my remarks, and I'm sorry if I wasn't clear about it, is that to the extent that the time periods become compressed, it seems to me that the line the board elects to draw as to when perhaps it would be appropriate to impose a one-year bar perhaps would be.
But you're not really linking this with the proposed rules?
Only to the
changes.
extent that I was suggesting there may be a decision that has to be made as to where the line might be drawn.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Torres.